I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Jaap de Roode. He is the Samuel C. Dobbs Professor of Biology at Emory University and the author of Doctors by Nature, which we'll be talking about today. Jaap is an expert in the population biology of parasites and virus transmission, as well as how animals defend themselves against these threats. Jaap, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
But how did you become interested in virology, evolutionary biology, and get involved in all this research?
I think my interest in parasites really started when I went to a one-day symposium, and this was in the Netherlands. When I was an undergraduate student, I worked in a lab studying basic genetics of a fungus that grows in the dung of rabbits. And
But how did
I
you
never
come to
really
that?
thought, but
You said that so casually, like that was the given, and then viruses were the new strange part. I'm even curious about that.
yeah, I wasn't really thinking much about parasites and pathogens at the time, but then my professor organized a one-day symposium, and that was on molecular ecology. So how do you use molecular methodology to study ecological questions? And one of the presenters at that symposium was my then future PhD advisor. He gave a talk on malaria parasites, different strains of malaria parasites in the same bloodstream and how they competed with each other. And to me, that was super interesting because it was basically thinking about ecology, different things competing with each other, just like, say, hyenas and lions would compete on the savannah. But here it was parasites competing for blood cells and then also having a shared enemy through immune systems. And that day was really the day that I thought parasites are interesting and this is what I want to study. So then I did my PhD working on malaria parasites with him. That was at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And then from there, I moved to the United States to study quite similar parasites of monarch butterflies. And that was really a great system for me because the malaria work I did was all very much based on the lab, and we used mice in the lab. But I really wanted to work on something that had wild populations you could look at as a natural system. And so finding that monarch butterflies have a parasite that's actually quite close to the malaria parasites in humans and mice, that was really exciting for me. And so that was 2005 that I started working on monarchs, and I still work on them. But the reason I do is because they become sick, and I'm really excited biologically. I'm not excited about getting parasites myself or about all the disease that they cause, but just from understanding how they infect and how they deal with their life cycles and the challenges they face. That was really what brought me to it.
But when you're studying these monarch butterflies, you're not breeding them in lab like typical experimental research.
Yeah. So
But then you release them into the wild, or you
no,
mentioned the
we don't
wildlife.
release. We do a lot of lab experiments where we can really study the effects of parasites on the monarch butterflies, and we can rear monarch butterflies in different species of milkweed. So monarchs are specialist feeders as caterpillars on milkweed. So we can test the direct effects of medicinal and non-medicinal milkweeds on monarch butterflies when they are infected. But besides that, we also do field work. So we can study monarchs, and monarchs are well known for their migration from the United States and Canada to Mexico every fall, and they travel thousands of miles all the way to central Mexico to overwinter. And so we can look at that natural population and find out what effects do parasites have on their ability to migrate those long distances. Yeah, so we do lab experiments, we do field work as well. And so it's a great system there where you can do both.
Now, I may have slipped earlier then when I said viruses. You're using the term parasites. Are those distinct?
Yeah, so, I use the word parasite for things that make other things sick, right? So usually people think of parasites as worms or ticks or maybe protozoan parasites like the ones that cause malaria. But I also include bacteria and viruses and fungi in that same, from the ecological point of view, they're all organisms that cause disease in the hosts that they infect. And personally, I don't, in the monarchs, we don't study viruses, but we study the protozoan parasites that cause virulence, which is the damage that they cause an infection. So, but yeah, I use them interchangeably.
I'm thinking way back to this last common evolutionary ancestor, last common ancestor of all life, this Luca idea, and then it branches from basically these simple single-celled organisms. Now, is that, do we have common ancestors with these parasites? And then this was just a very different branch that those simple cells took instead of
Oh yeah.
multicellular life?
Yeah, yeah. So when you think, we as humans have the same common ancestor as protozoans and worms and fungi, bacteria. We all have the same common ancestor. The only thing we don't have a common ancestor with is viruses. So viruses are not really part of the tree of life, and they have evolved multiple times. They have different origins. We're still trying to understand how they evolve, but they're not all connected to the same common ancestor for themselves, and also not for us. But yeah, we are related to the things that make us sick for most of the organisms.
I've never heard that before. I know this may be outside your primary research area, but could you say more about where we think viruses initially came from?
So I think there's multiple hypotheses, and it's not really a field of study that I do. But so part of one origin could be that there are bits of genetic material that come from other organisms and start living their own parasitic life, and that may have then put together different components that then became a virus. But I would have to, look at that a lot more. I haven't really studied that myself.
The reason I'm bringing that up and trying to piece together in my head, I've heard of this Red Queen hypothesis from
Mhm.
Alice in Wonderland. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. That us evolving defenses against parasites is like that, and that could have been one of the primary evolutionary incentives for mutations and for just the multicellular complexity and diversity that we see. Now, that already implies that the viruses existed from the start.
They probably were around very early on, but we also know that a lot of other parasitic organisms have been around for a long time. And you're right that when you think about the evolution of organisms, that a lot of that evolution is driven by co-evolution, where different organisms exert selection on each other. So you have one organism that gets attacked and it evolves stronger defenses. Then the organism that attacks it evolves better ways to overcome those defenses, and that just keeps on going. And that certainly can have contributed to a lot of diversity that we see in life. And you're right, that means that early on there must have been parasitic organisms. And so we definitely think that viruses were there, bacteria, some of them have probably been parasitic for as long as there were other organisms that they could parasitize as well.
And this might have even happened before sexual reproduction evolved, because I've heard this
Mhm.
as one of the theories for specifically why it makes sense not just to clone yourself continually.
Yeah, so the red queen hypothesis, like you said, so this is from the book from the Looking Glass, where the red queen tells Alice, you have to run in the same place, or you have to run as fast as you can, but you stay in the same place. And the idea of this co-evolution is that you can evolve better and better defenses, but if the parasite keeps on evolving better and better ways to overcome those defenses, at the end of the day, neither of you got any further, right? Um, and so the hypothesis is indeed that these kind of dynamics really favor outcrossing. So where you combine the genomes of, in some cases, males and females, but there's a lot of other organisms where it doesn't have to be males or females, it can be mating types, or in bacteria, they can actually exchange genes through different mechanisms. But that outcrossing, so that combining of different genetic material, allows for organisms to come up with new genetic combinations that can then help prevent those infections or better defend them against those infections.
Mhm. So, Jeff, my primary research is on brain development in humans, but I've had a long-standing interest in evolution and particularly evolutionary psychology. So I have some understanding of evolutionary brain development, but
Mhm.
the further back we go, especially when you're talking about these very simple organisms where you can make arguments whether or not they have a nervous system, like it's
Mhm.
kind of on the fuzzy borders. I imagine the same might be the case with the immune system. At
Mm.
what point do you really say that something definitively has an immune system, as opposed to it's just maybe protecting itself by these random mutations?
Well, that depends on how you define an immune system. And so until quite recently, a lot of people would define immune systems based on the immune system that we have. So they may have said, unless you have B cells and T cells that we use as protection against all sorts of pathogens, they would say you don't really have an immune system. When I was in graduate school, and so this was in the early 2000s, there was the whole field of insect immunology was just coming up. And at the time, people really thought that, oh, insects don't have any, they have an innate immune system, but they don't have any sophisticated immune systems. But then it was discovered they also have immune memory. They can recognize things that infect them before better than things they haven't seen before. They just use different mechanisms. Now, we talk about CRISPR, that mechanism that we can use to genetically modify organisms. It's being used now to cure genetic diseases in humans. The Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine went to discoverers of CRISPR a few years ago. But, CRISPR comes from bacteria, and it's basically an immune system that bacteria use against their viruses that's probably been around for a very, very long time. So, depending on how do you define an immune system, and I would say it's any system that allows you to resist the infection by something else or mitigate the negative effects of that. If you define it that way, then pretty much probably all organisms that are alive and are attacked by something have some level of immunity.
Have you read Walter Isaacson's biography on Jennifer Doudna?
I have not.
It's really interesting, and it comes with a crash course on a lot of this because I have no background in cell biology whatsoever. So when I first heard of CRISPR, I mean, I don't know what I thought it was working as, but I assumed just human technology. So it was
Mhm.
really cool to learn that it's in fact tapping into this ancient evolved bacterial
Yeah.
immune system.
Yes. No, I mean, that is true for so many things that we use. We have discovered it in nature and then we use it. The same as with it is true for PCR. PCR is a method by which we amplify DNA, and we use it in molecular biology. We use it in forensics. You think about 23andMe, companies like that, or a lot of people do this for their dogs, sequencing genomes. It's all based on an enzyme that bacteria evolved to survive in hot springs, because some bacteria can live in really high temperatures, almost boiling temperatures that would kill our enzymes, but they have enzymes that they can use. And so we just use those for our molecular biology and our technology. So it's true for so many things. Enzymes that we use in cleaning laundry, they all come from nature as well. So a lot of the times when we think we have discovered some technology, it's usually copied from nature because organisms already did it before us.
I don't know what it is about the molecular level of analysis that has always been more difficult for me to understand. And yet the population biology has been more intuitive to me. And what I like about your work, it's kind of combining both. But I mean, I don't think of viruses or parasites as populations, like
Mm.
individual organisms. I just think of them as they're infecting some host and they're like, it's almost like I put them into the same category as hormones or neurotransmitters, like just tiny things that I don't really
Mm.
understand.
Mm.
But I really like this evolutionary framing that they're their own organisms with their own incentives.
That's right. And their own struggles as well, right? Because when you take the viewpoint of a parasite, and most people don't, but I find it utterly intriguing. And you think about the life cycle of a parasite, and a parasite infects a host. And then in order to survive or leave offspring, it really in some ways needs to get transmitted to new hosts, right? But the host is doing everything it can to avoid it, to kill it, to take care of it. And in the face of that, this parasite has to survive and reproduce. It's a real struggle. So I find it utterly intriguing to think about it from that point of view, because we often think, oh, parasites are nasty, and they try to infect the hosts. But you take a step back and look at them as organisms that have their own struggles. It's actually really interesting.
Hmm. So I've always been confused about not the incentive for something to parasitize. That's pretty straightforward, but why they cause sickness or even go to the extreme of killing their host, because then they typically die along with the host. So it seems counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. That's, in fact, the question that brought me to the parasites and monarchs in the first place. Just really asking, why do parasites cause harm to their host? And that is why we call them parasites in the first place, because it seems counterintuitive. Not in all cases, right? Because actually some parasites have to kill the host to get um, to the next host, or they have a free living life stage and they have to kill the host to get out. So you see that for a lot of parasites. Some parasites, for example, that have multiple hosts, they infect a snail, but they reproduce in a bird, then the snail has to be eaten by the bird, right? So the snail has to die so that the parasite can get to the bird. So there are cases where death of the host is actually necessary for the parasite. Now, in many cases, that isn't the case. And so then the question is, why do they end up killing the host when that is actually detrimental to themselves? Because when they kill the host too soon, they actually kill themselves before they have a chance to get transmitted to another host. Well, it turns out the reason for that is that it's essentially a byproduct of what they need to do to get transmitted. And so when you look at parasites, viruses, bacteria, protozoans that infect the host, they can often start an infection with a really low number of parasitic individuals, but then they grow up to really, really high numbers, really high titers. And even though you can have millions or billions of a virus or a bacterium or a protozoan circulating in your body, chances that they make it to the next host, either through a sneeze or a mosquito bite, are still very low. And so basically they're called in this idea that they have to reproduce like crazy to get transmitted. But sometimes that means that if they reproduce too much, they grow too high numbers, they actually kill the host. So, but too low is not good. They don't get transmitted. Too high is not good because they can kill the host. So there is a middle ground where they have to reach a level to actually get transmitted. But that means that in some cases they end up killing the host, even though that would be counterproductive for them.
Well, we heard about this during COVID. I don't know if this held up as true, but there was discussion about the variants actually evolving to be less severe, specifically because they were more transmissible.
Yes, so and that's often thought to be the case, and I think a lot of the time this comes from that intuitive idea that if you kill too fast, you don't get transmitted. And that didn't necessarily play out completely with COVID, right? Because we got some variants that were actually more detrimental coming up. But I think there is a certain level, the hard thing sometimes with these cases is that it's not just the parasite, in this case, the virus that's evolving, the hosts are evolving too, right? And so we're not necessarily genetically evolving with, because individuals don't evolve, it's populations that do. But of course, we have immune systems that start responding. We have vaccines. So then it's really hard to determine have the viruses become much more detrimental or not. And so, but, it doesn't have to be the case. Sometimes it's true that a virus crosses a species barrier and is initially really virulent, becomes less virulent over time. But it doesn't have to be the case. It really depends on how the viruses transmit. And especially for a lot of diseases such as COVID, where transmission can happen before you even have symptoms, there isn't really a cost necessarily associated with that infection, right? Because if you have already made it to the next host and you end up killing the original host, it doesn't actually select against those viruses that have already transmitted. So it depends on a lot of details, and a lot of those details we just didn't understand when COVID first arose.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it partially answers the question when you say some parasites have to kill their host to spread. But
Mhm.
then for me, it pushes the question even further back of why would they evolve to do that? Doesn't it seem simpler to stay within the organism and pursue the classic strategy? So clearly there was a niche of this extra type that specifically needs to kill its host. Like, could you say more about what the selection pressures would be for that?
I think there's just so many ways that organisms can evolve. It all depends on how they obtain fitness, right? And so any mutations that happen that cause an organism to leave more offspring can be selected for. And so there are many different approaches to life and to creating offspring, right? So you can eat plants or you can eat meat, and not that it's not necessary, right? But it's just that sometimes you get mutations that allow an organism to use a different host, to use a different source of food. They leave more offspring, so that trait gets selected for and get passed on. So that is how I view this diversification. And as soon as you have more different organisms, there's more opportunities, there's more different lifestyles that can evolve. And so a lot of different lifestyles have evolved. And it's just different ways of utilizing the resources that are available. But there's no foresight, right, in evolution. It's not like organisms, would think, oh, this would be a better way, so I'm going to evolve this way. It's just all happenstance. You get mutations, they allow you to do certain things. And if that allows you to leave offspring, you pass on those traits, and that's how they evolve.
Some of them are so crazy complex and niche and scary. I'm thinking about that one that gets into the brain, I think an insect's brain, and then
Mhm.
it hacks it and controls its motion and causes it to climb really high up, and then it just stays there and dies, and then
Yep.
it flowers outside of the head.
Yeah, so that's Ophiocordyceps. That's the fungus that The Last of Us, do you know that TV
Uh-huh.
show? The second season just came out or is about to come out. And so that's what that show is based on, right? And of course, then it's based on humans and zombies being infected by this fungus. But yeah, this Ophiocordyceps fungi occur in a lot of different insects. And what you just described is very common for ants when they get infected. It controls the brain and makes the ant leave the nest, climb up to a point, sit upside down, and then bite the vein of a leaf. And then you get the mushroom essentially coming out of the head and sprinkling spores on top of other ants that then get infected. And so, yeah, there are a lot of parasites that manipulate the behavior of their host that helps them to get transmitted. And it doesn't just happen in insects, it happens in humans too. So, a great example is rabies virus. So, a lot of us have never really encountered anyone with rabies these days in our society. And that's because there isn't much left and we have got a really good vaccine against it. But rabies does, it's a virus that infects you and it gets to the brain as well and then manipulates the behavior to become more aggressive. And at the same time, the virus also interferes with your mechanisms that allow you to swallow. So you start salivating a lot more, and that saliva is filled with viruses. And then you have aggression combined with lots of viruses in the saliva. So then when people bite each other, when animals bite us, those viruses get transmitted. So that's also a manipulation of behavior. And yeah, there's other great stories of worms that infect crickets and make the crickets drown so they can come out and then mate with other worms. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really beautiful. Again, kind of gruesome, but from the parasite's point of view, it's pretty clever stuff.
Yeah, it's scary clever, and it's also interesting to me that the how you describe it as beautiful. I see it scientifically, but then there's the other more instinctive part where you have this kind of disgust reaction.
Of course, yeah. And so I say beautiful from my background as a biologist who studies life, but I don't want any of those parasites myself, and I don't wish them upon anyone. But it is really intriguing the ways that these parasites have evolved, that they can manipulate the behavior
Mhm.
of hosts in their own benefit. It's really interesting.
Yeah, these neurological parasites are really surprising and fascinating to me as a neuroscientist because even though we have some understanding, you can plant the electrodes and stimulate motion or elicit hallucinations, and we have some level of
Mhm.
specificity there, and Neuralink is trying to do that as well, but nowhere near to the point that, you can implant something and then literally control the organism's behavior like a video game and make them walk over. And yet the simple fungus seems to have learned how to do that. I mean, not so simple, but I wonder if there probably are people researching that, right? Like, do we know anything about how specifically they're hijacking the brain? And is that
Yeah,
how
and
active?
there's a lot of research happening on that, and it seems that these parasites can produce chemicals that either interfere or mimic the neurotransmitters that are used, the chemical messengers in the brain, and that they therefore can change some of these behaviors. But the level of specificity, we don't really understand that yet. But I think what is interesting is when you think about humans have studied neuroscience for maybe a few hundred years, if that, right? But these fungi have studied the neuroscience of ants for millions of years. So they've had more time. So I think, well, given enough time, we'll figure it out, right? And also these and that's also the power of natural selection. Is just small changes that slightly change the behavior of these hosts can increase the survival of these parasites, and you step by step they just become better, and they have had a lot of time to do it. I think sometimes as humans we look at these things like, oh, there's no way I could do this, but then again we have so little understanding of the vast time scales over which these things have evolved. And we can't even imagine what it's like to live in the medieval ages, let alone understand what a million years means, right? But yet
Hmm.
that, we talk about millions, tens of millions of years over which these things have evolved.
Hmm. I'm also surprised that some of them that seem so scarily effective, like rabies, you mentioned, basically the closest thing we have to a zombie virus. And though you said now we have great vaccines against it,
Mhm.
it seems like that would spread really quickly. I imagine that in a hunter-gatherer society, like if even one person got rabies and there was no cure, and then they went rabid and attacked someone while living in these close bands, foaming at the mouth, and then it spreads and everyone does it. Like I'm surprised that some of those things didn't completely wipe us out or get wiped out. Like how does it exist in these low numbers?
Well, I think part of it is that there have been local wipeouts. And, when we think about the history of humans living in smaller populations, it's probably true that there have been plenty of small populations that have been wiped out by parasites and pathogens. We only have to think of some major mortality events like the 1918 flu that killed a lot of people. The Black Plague during medieval times that really killed massive numbers of people. You know, there is variation always in any natural population in terms of resistance. So some people are just not as susceptible. And we saw that with COVID as well, right? So some people just didn't get as sick as others. And we have some understanding that there's genetic differences between people for that. And that's true for a lot of these other cases as well. But there's also other defenses, right? So you imagine that someone who has rabies doesn't, people don't just sit around and have themselves be bitten by a person like that, right? There's other protective mechanisms. If you're in a community and someone starts randomly biting people, you probably knock that person out or even kill them, right? So there's other ways that the spread of things like this could have been prevented. And generally speaking, it's really difficult. And this has been shown theoretically, with theoretical mathematical models. It's really hard to wipe out a host species by a parasite because there's usually kind of a critical density that they need to get transmitted from one host to another. Um, and and we reduce that when we use vaccinations. But that means even when parasites reduce a population, it gets to a point where the parasite no longer has enough opportunities to get transmitted. And so, yeah, there have been big bottlenecks, but wiping out whole species is probably pretty rare for parasites to do.
Are people sort of inoculating themselves? I know that this is basically how the immune system works. Like you pick up pathogens as you go about and it learns from them. But I'm wondering it, how much of that existed in cultural transmission prior to vaccines, like intentionally. Do we know anything about uh, how sometimes cultural psychologists have argued that even if culture has a folk theory as to why something works, like cooking rituals, for example,
Mhm.
they don't
Yeah.
know back then that they're killing pathogens, but they're doing it anyway. So they could have
Mhm.
like their own religious reasons, which are approximately wrong, but ultimately they produce the same effect.
Yeah, and there is actually um, examples. When we think about vaccination, we often think of that as something that was discovered recently. But there is evidence, and I don't have the exact examples in my head right now, but there are more ancient societies that did the kind of inoculations of pathogens that we now would describe as vaccination and actually protected themselves that way. So that has been happening. And then there are a lot of ways, like you mentioned, cooking. The use of spices is often seen as something that can bring down bacterial loads in food, for example. And then, of course, humans have used all sorts of medicinal properties of plants and other compounds to help them against diseases as well.
I've heard this about the gut bacteria, and that it also explains why t children develop what we call adult tastes, like for dark chocolate as opposed to milk chocolate or bitter coffee or bitter alcohols, that the child's immune system is less developed, so it's just net harmful, but once it's strong enough that it's almost like chemotherapy, you take a small dose of toxin and you're strong enough to handle it, but it wipes
Mm.
out the bad stuff.
I don't know the details of that, but it's an interesting hypothesis where we know for sure that the tastes differ, the microbiome changes as well. And we also know that a lot of populations, that includes animals and humans alike, are basically sampling a lot of different things, and there is this, especially in adults, preference for things that taste bitter and a lot of bitter tasting things, and that is chocolate, that is, and coffee and other things as well. That they're protective. They often can kill things, but they also provide a lot of antioxidants that reduce the damage of infections and other things. So that relationship between bitterness and health benefits is pretty clear in humans and other animals as well.
And the bitterness or spiciness, that's often plants their own version of this same type of parasitic immune system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the chemicals that taste bitter, the chemicals that make plants spicy, they have all evolved again in a co-evolutionary arms race. And you think about plants, they're constantly being attacked, not just by parasites and pathogens, but also by herbivores, because everything wants to eat plants. And so over time, they have evolved all sorts of chemicals to protect them against herbivores, against parasites and pathogens. And all of those chemicals we find very attractive now. And so whether that's the caffeine in coffee or the alkaloids in chocolate or the capsaicin that we use in hot sauce, those things are or the caffeine, I mentioned it, or the nicotine in tobacco, those are all chemicals that are really effective against insects and other herbivores that try to eat those plants.
Mhm. Do other animals selectively seek those out?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's, one of the really interesting thing is this whole plant kingdom, but also other animals and also fungi. They've evolved all these different chemicals, and animals are really good at using those chemicals as medicine when they are infected with parasites and pathogens.
Mhm. What about hallucinogens? I know that certain fungi evolved that, but
Mhm.
that seems stranger to come up with an evolutionary story. The poison makes sense to me, but is it just that this is a type of poison and it's looking for a broader set of aversion?
Yeah, so you see a lot of these chemicals that invoke hallucinations or make you feel euphoric or really good, are evolved in different contexts. And then, so say you take a chemical, let's say cocaine, for example. Why do plants produce cocaine? It's not to make people addicted or not to make them feel good or forget about pain, right? But what these plants have done, they've evolved these chemicals because they're selected to produce chemicals that help them against insects. So these chemicals interfere with the nervous systems of insects that try to eat the plants, and that can cause paralysis or you know trembling or it really convulsions and things like that in the insects. And then our nervous systems are similar enough that these chemicals affect our nervous systems, but they're different enough to have different effects, right? So, and it's the same with these chemicals that cause hallucinations. So they have evolved in different contexts that may kill insects that try to kill the plants, but they happen to act on our nervous systems to give us these hallucinations. It's basically a byproduct.
So a lot of the negative symptoms of sickness, sometimes it's not necessarily the parasite per se, but it's the body's immune system working against it.
Absolutely.
So we're coughing or we're raising
Mhm.
our body temperature to try and kill it. And
Yeah.
sometimes, I mean, I guess the way to think about it is sometimes if we die from a sickness, or from an allergic reaction, that's another example. Your
Mhm.
body really kills you before the virus does. And
Yes.
I'm trying to imagine what would happen without that. I guess it would kill you more slowly, potentially.
Yeah, I mean it's a fine balance, and it's true for COVID-19 as well. And a lot of viral infections, what we end up dying of is the huge amount of inflammation that our own bodies are doing because of our immune systems reacting to that initial infection, right? But without those responses, we wouldn't be able to keep the growth of the viruses or bacteria or other parasites in check. But again, it's one of those things when you overshoot and you do too much, you can actually kill the own body of that organism that has the immune system. And so again, it's a balance between you want a response that's strong enough to keep the parasites in check, but sometimes that means it's so strong that you end up killing yourself.
So let's say with COVID, if you know enough about this, if you had no inflammation, if you had no cough, if the virus just existed in you and multiplied, what would the negative symptoms be that weren't the immune system self-inflicted?
I think you would, yeah, I don't know the details. I would have to think about that more. But what would happen is, of course, when the viruses infect particular cells and tissues, they can end up destroying that. So you could lose the function of specific tissues. So in this case, you could think about viruses that infect a lot of respiratory cells. You may actually have impaired respiration, right? And so, of course, you get impaired respiration because of the inflammation as well. But you think about an example like malaria parasites that infect your blood cells. You know, without the immune system, they would probably end up destroying so many blood cells that you cannot carry around the oxygen in your body anymore. And so you would die of that. So, yeah, there are some clear cases where the parasites would just destroy the tissues that you need for survival, and your immune system protects you against that. But that comes with the side effects that can be just as detrimental in the end.
So in your experimental work, you mentioned earlier looking at effects of feeding butterflies different
Yeah.
foods with different toxins or different medications. Do you ever do manipulations of the physiology itself? Like, could you selectively gene edit or turn on or off different aspects of the immune system?
Well, we cannot in monarch butterflies. That's really hard, but you could do that in other systems. So our experiments are very much based on manipulation of, the choices that the monarchs have and whether they are infected. And so we have done experiments where we can infect or leave uninfected monarch caterpillars and then see what kind of plants they choose when we give them choices, and haven't found any, preferences there. But when we do the same with female butterflies that lay eggs, because the parasites that we study in monarch butterflies, they form spores in the abdomen of the butterflies. And when they lay eggs, some of these parasites get scattered to the eggs and the milkweed on which the eggs are laid. And they cannot avoid that. But what the females can do when they lay their eggs, because they're very picky when they choose the plants for their caterpillars. Say if they lay their eggs on lettuce, then the caterpillars are going to die. They cannot eat lettuce. So it has to be milkweed. But then between different milkweeds, the monarchs can choose what they're going to lay their eggs on. And they then, when they're infected, prefer to lay their eggs on more medicinal plants. And they have shown that in experimental studies. But how they do that, how they know that, how they change that, we don't know that yet. So that's something that we hope to do with more manipulative experiments. But we certainly personally aren't at the point where we can do gene editing and really try to understand this at the molecular level.
Hmm. So in the US research context, there's often this NSF versus NIH tension, and clearly there's always the beauty of basic science, just
Mm-hmm.
understanding nature for its own sake. But then
Yeah.
also there's often the incentive, like the what are the impacts that's going to come of understanding this? And a lot of this work is often talked about in maybe we're going to build up model systems and then eventually understand more about human immune system and then prevent
Mhm.
something like COVID in the future. I'm wondering if either from your own work or other prominent examples, um, you have examples of this type of basic science work leading to some uh, applied discovery.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think, one of the reasons I really like being in the United States is the National Science Foundation, because they do fund very basic science, and realizing and understanding that you cannot know in advance what sort of applications research is going to have. The only thing you do know is that when you do enough basic research, there will be applications in the future. And you mentioned, we talked about CRISPR before. Now, CRISPR wasn't studied with the aim of manipulating other organisms or curing genetic diseases for humans. It was studied because people were just interested in finding out what bacteria and viruses do to each other, how they interact, how they evolve. A very basic, then you discover this thing, then you realize you can use this for gene editing, then you realize you can use it for human health. And same with the enzyme of bacteria that live in hot springs that we mentioned before. People that study microbes just want to know, does anything live in these hot springs? It's amazing, it does, and then start dissecting that, figuring out how they do it. And now that underlies everything that we do in modern biology and modern medicine as well. So there's so many examples, but I think that, or to talk about the Ozempic, the recent drug that helps against obesity. Where did it come from? It comes from Gila monsters, which are lizards, and people just studied it not with that in mind, but because they're super interested in what do these animals produce? How do they live? How do they survive? So, and I think that's the beauty of basic science, and that's certainly the reason that I'm here studying monarch butterflies and their parasites. And in my book, I talk about a lot of different examples of how people have found that animals use medicine. And, but, once you realize that, then you can start thinking of applications. And so one really cool example, I think, is the example of cats and how they use catnip and silvervine. So anyone who owns a cat knows that their cat may like rolling around in catnip, maybe buy toys at the pet store that are impregnated with the chemicals of catnip. And it's only the last few years that researchers in Japan have shown that by doing this, they coat themselves in chemicals that keep mosquitoes away. And so then they patented the chemical that these cats like, because we can maybe use it as a repellent for mosquitoes in humans, right? But again, it started off by, I just want to know why my cat does this crazy thing that I see. So yeah, it's endless. Basically, everything in science started with basic curiosity, and that's why I think it's so important to do that.
It's really cool hearing those tie-ins and then also just thinking of how many species there are and then any nature documentary you see or like textbooks written about them that people have devoted their whole careers
Mhm.
to studying behavior of other organisms. It's so
Yeah,
interesting.
it is so interesting, and it's so valuable because I always think, the applications are great, but the fact that there are nature documentaries and books on nature, sure, people love nature, right? And actually understanding nature, being in nature is a really healthy thing for people to do. And so I think a lot of people also realize just understanding, even if there were no applications, just the understanding of how things work, how animals deal with their environment, how plants grow and how they defend themselves. It's just utterly amazing. And I guess being part of the natural world, we have this innate interest in it as well. Right. So
Mm.
I think doing, basic research, even for the sake of basic research, is worth it for our society. But it's definitely nice that there is all these applications and that you may not, and you wouldn't find them if you didn't let people do this research based on curiosity, right? But no one could have predicted any of the applications that we just mentioned. There's just no way.
This is more of an evolutionary psychology question. I wonder if you've thought about it. A lot of people have this innate disgust aversion to insects, and that might be because they could carry pathogens. But strange exceptions that children seem to love, adults love too, for that matter, ladybugs and butterflies. And I think it's because they're colorful and they're
Mm,
beautiful. But th when you think about it, they're kind of the same thing. Like a ladybug is kind of like a fly, and if it wasn't red, it would probably be more ugly than pretty. And you see the same comparison in butterflies versus moths. Like something just about the color, people seem to appreciate more. And I just wonder what what's going on there. Because
mm.
even if the color is beautiful and we've evolved that for other reasons, like detecting ripe fruit, for example, you would think that if there's this strong aversion to insects more generally, that would still take over.
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think there is a universal aversion to insects. I think it's a very Western concept. And, when you go to different parts of the world and you look at indigenous cultures, they don't have that aversion to insects at all. And in fact, a lot of food is based on insects. There are so many cultures around the world that eat a lot of different insects. There's a lot of cultures around the world that celebrate insects in lots of different ways. So you can think of dung beetles in ancient Egypt, very, very important. And so you see that in a lot of different places. I think somehow and I think it's a general thing, stepping away from nature that we have done mostly in Western society, and thinking that nature needs to be kept outside, that we're different, that we're better. And I especially feel that a lot of people perceive insects as threats, because even when you can exclude, say, wolves from your house, you may still get roaches inside, right? So I think it's a very modern and probably sociological reasons for this aversion to insects. Now, there are universal disgusts. People generally don't like feces or throw up, and they avoid it. And animals do that too. And that makes sense because they're really good sources for infectious diseases and really bad bacteria. And, but yeah, so even though most people don't like insects, they make an exception. But most people in the Western world don't like insects. They make exception for those colorful, beautiful things. And I think it's partly because we have a lot of children's books and children's programs that have ladybugs and monarch butterflies, and very few that have cute cockroaches. But I think if we had more books like that, we could probably change that.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah. Were you around for A Bug's Life? Did you watch that like 20 years ago for
I saw
Pixar?
parts of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that did a good job making them seem pretty cute.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to share from Doctors by Nature or about your ongoing or future research? Anything else you want to share, Jeff?
Yeah, so I think what really surprised me, and it comes back to what we just said, this idea of distancing ourselves from nature, which is a very Western concept that also comes with the idea that we want to be better than nature, right? And so we have this idea that we need to be different. And so this idea that medicine is something that humans do and animals don't. Again, that's something that you don't see in a lot of other cultures. And one of the biggest surprises for me in writing this book was that indigenous healers and shamans have for thousands of years looked at animals to get knowledge about medicine and copy their behaviors to create medicines. And so you look at shamans, for example, in North America, that often try to become bears. So they're bear shamans. And the reason for that is that bears have a lot of medicinal knowledge, and people have learned from that. One really surprising finding for me was aspirin. Aspirin is that pharmaceutical drug that a lot of us have used, but it turns out that bears discovered it first, because when they come out of their hibernation, they're all stiff, they're all inflamed. And one of the first things they do is rip the bark of willow trees and eat that. Turns out that bark is full of salicylic acid, and that's the chemical that we now use in aspirin. And, so just looking at nature and giving these animals credit that they may have some medicinal knowledge that we don't and that we can learn from them, I think was a really eye-opening experience for me. And it's really something I hope that people take away from the book and say, yeah, we should look at these animals. We can learn from them. We're not necessarily better than them, right? And you know, we know things they don't know, but they know things we don't know. We can learn from each other.
Wow. That's all fascinating, Jaap. And I love how you're able to tap into so many different species as examples of just very, very deep knowledge of biology. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, and you're welcome. Thank you.